Is Putin preparing to use a tactical nuke in Ukraine? Well, 3 years ago, I wrote an article listing the warning signs that Vladimir Putin might be preparing to use a nuke. Now, most of them involved military activity. Russian nuclear units moving, American command aircraft flying, radiation detection planes deploying to Europe, senior government officials suddenly canceling their schedules. Then I included one diplomatic signal. I wrote, if you see Beijing publicly warn Putin against using a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, we should start to worry. Well, according to President Zelenskyy, China has now warned Russia in what he described as ultimatum form that Moscow should stop considering using nuclear weapons against Ukraine. Holy sh**. Senior Chinese officials reportedly confirmed to a Western government that they had delivered that message before the NATO summit just last week. The possibility of Russian tactical nuclear use was also discussed during at least one meeting between Zelenskyy and another leader at the summit. But before anyone turns the basement into a fallout shelter and starts fighting strangers at Costco over canned beans, Western officials also told Bloomberg they've seen no signs whatsoever that Russia is currently preparing to deploy a tactical nuke. Okay, so this report does not mean a Russian nuclear strike is imminent. It does mean that one of the specific warning signs I identified in 2023 has appeared, at least in a form close enough that we need to examine it carefully. Hey friends, Wes here. I'm a defense journalist, Army and Air Force veteran. Today, we need to separate three things that tend to get mashed together whenever Putin starts waving his nuclear saber around. The first is rhetoric. The second is diplomatic concern. And the third is actual military preparation. Russia is clearly producing the first. China's warning suggests the second is rising, and there is currently no evidence of the third. That leaves us in an uncomfortable middle ground. No mushroom cloud appears imminent, but serious governments are apparently discussing how to prevent one. And the most important part of China's warning may be what Beijing heard before it decided the warning was necessary. Let's start with what China actually said, because the apparent novelty hides a familiar policy. According to Zelenskyy, Russian officials and major media figures have increasingly asked whether Moscow should answer Ukrainian attacks inside Russia with nuclear weapons. China responded firmly. Zelenskyy said that Beijing communicated that there cannot even be thoughts about the use of nuclear weapons. Bloomberg reported that senior Chinese officials confirmed delivering this message during discussions with a Western government before the NATO summit. Now, Beijing hasn't publicly confirmed that specific conversation, and China's foreign ministry didn't respond to Bloomberg's request for comments, or mine. So my 2023 tripwire hasn't been crossed exactly as written. I said to watch for Beijing publicly warning Putin. What we have here is a reported private warning made public by Zelenskyy and supported by European officials familiar with the diplomatic traffic. That's one step short of the exact scenario I described, and it's also far more significant than another Russian television host shouting about radioactive ash while sitting underneath enough studio makeup to survive the initial flash. China's broad position against nuclear use isn't new. Beijing's official Ukraine peace proposal, published in 2023, said nukes must not be used, nuclear war must not be fought, and the threats involving nuclear weapons should be opposed. Xi Jinping has repeated that position in meetings with European leaders, and Chinese officials restated it again in February and April of 2026. So China has spent years laying down this particular marker. The new element is the reported delivery. This wasn't a generic paragraph inside of a peace proposal written for international consumption. According to the reporting, senior Chinese officials aimed the message directly at Moscow, while Russian nuclear rhetoric was climbing and Ukraine was increasing its strikes deep inside Russia. That timing gives the warning weight. Russia revised its official nuclear doctrine in November of 2024. The updated doctrine widened the circumstances under which Moscow claims it could use nuclear weapons and included conventional attacks by a non-nuclear country supported by a nuclear power. That's Ukraine. In plain English, Russia wrote itself a legal theory under which a Ukrainian strike using Western support could be treated as aggression involving the United States or another nuclear-armed NATO country like the UK. The language remains deliberately broad because ambiguity is part of the weapon, but Putin wants every Western official approving military aid to wonder whether one more missile, one more target, or one more Ukrainian breakthrough crosses some invisible red line. Russia's nuclear doctrine is part military policy and part haunted house sound system. The objective is to make everyone jump before Moscow actually has to do anything. The rhetoric has become uglier in 2026. Sergei Karaganov, a Russian foreign policy hawk with access to Kremlin circles, has repeatedly argued for preemptive nuclear use against the West. In May, he wrote that Russia needed to instill primal fear in Western elites so they would abandon their support for Ukraine. Putin himself has spent years suggesting that Western support for Ukrainian strikes could lead to catastrophic escalation. The Kremlin's messaging follows a recognizable pattern. Russian forces struggle. Ukraine hits something embarrassing. And then Moscow discovers an exciting new way to mention nuclear war. So for much of this conflict, that method has worked. Western governments delayed tanks, aircraft, missiles, and strike permissions because they feared Putin might escalate. While Moscow extracted strategic value from nuclear weapons without removing a single warhead from storage. Repeated threats have gradually worn down that effect. Ukraine now strikes military facilities, oil infrastructure, air bases, factories, and logistics targets deep inside Russia almost daily. Putin's red lines have been crossed so many times that the pain is mostly tire tracks. That creates a dangerous problem for the Kremlin. A threat that never produces action eventually loses coercive power. Russian hardliners are now arguing that Moscow must prove the threat is real or accept that the West no longer fears it. China's intervention appears designed to stop that argument before somebody inside Russia decides to demonstrate commitment with an actual weapon. And China has more leverage over Moscow than anyone else. Russia now reportedly imports more than 90% of its sanctioned technology through China. Chinese trade routes supply machine tools, microelectronics, industrial components, and dual-use equipment that help Russia manufacture drones, missiles, vehicles, and other military hardware. Beijing may not supply every weapon directly, but it keeps the production lines breathing. Putin can dismiss another Western condemnation, but he can't easily dismiss the country holding much of his industrial supply chain. China's motives aren't sentimental either. Xi Jinping hasn't suddenly placed a little Ukrainian flag emoji in his social media bio and started arguing with tankies. China benefits from a Russia that distracts the United States, consumes Western weapons, divides Europe, sells discounted energy, and depends increasingly on Beijing. A Russian nuclear strike could destroy that arrangement and harm China directly. It could trigger direct Western military intervention. It could produce a much harder sanctions regime against any country helping Moscow. It could turn Russia from a useful partner into a radioactive diplomatic liability. Nuclear use could also encourage additional countries to pursue their own nuclear deterrence. A world where one state successfully uses a tactical nuclear weapon to preserve territorial conquest would teach every vulnerable government the same lesson. Treaties and alliances are nice, although an atomic warhead gets people to return your calls. China does not need to support Ukraine to oppose that outcome. Beijing needs the nuclear taboo to hold because nuclear proliferation across Europe and Asia would make China's own security environment considerably worse. There was another reason this report caught my attention. In 2023, I wrote that the United States might respond to evidence of imminent Russian nuclear use by quietly showing some intelligence to China. That logic was simple. Washington might not be able to persuade Putin directly, but it could force Xi Jinping to choose between restraining Moscow and accepting responsibility for the consequences. Bloomberg's report says senior Chinese officials discussed the warnings with a Western government. It doesn't say that Western intelligence prompted the message. We don't know what information was exchanged, what Beijing independently observed, or whether China was reacting primarily to Russian media rhetoric. That connection remains speculation. Still, the diplomatic geometry looks familiar to me. Western governments are discussing Russian tactical nuclear use. China is warning Moscow. Zelenskyy says the warning came in ultimatum-like language. NATO leaders raised the subject during summit meetings. That is more than internet anxiety. It is also less than evidence of an operational nuclear decision, so let's update the warning signs for 2026. Here's what to watch for if Putin plans to use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. Detonated either as a show of force in an uninhabited part of Ukraine or in the Black Sea. The first rule to watch for is what Russia moves, not what Russian television says. Russia stores nuclear warheads across a network of permanent storage facilities. A tactical strike would likely require some combination of warhead movement, specialized security, delivery unit preparation, command and control activity, and changes in the posture of nuclear-capable aircraft or missile units. Any one movement could be an exercise. several coordinated movements near the same theater would look different. Western intelligence would watch suspected storage sites, roads, rail lines, Iskander units, air bases, communications networks, and the personnel associated with nuclear handling. Russia might disperse delivery systems or increase security around specific units, maybe restrict local airspace or move specialized support vehicles. Frontline troops might receive additional nuclear, biological, and chemical protective equipment. Commanders could issue new instructions about radiation exposure, decontamination, or operating inside a contaminated area. Then again, Russian commanders once allowed their soldiers to dig defensive positions in irradiated soil near Chernobyl in 2022, so trusting the Russian military to protect its own troops remains an analytical gamble with very poor historical record. Russia is estimated to have roughly 4,400 nuclear warheads, including up to around 2,000 intended for non-strategic forces. Analysts estimate that the weapons are stored at roughly 40 permanent sites, which means meaningful movement away from those facilities could produce a detectable intelligence signature. On the American side, watch for a cluster of changes. Because if the Americans think Putin is about to use a nuke, you're going to see some things happen in the States. An unusual increase in strategic command readiness would matter, so would changes involving the E-4B National Airborne Operations Center, the aircraft designed to support national command authority during the worst imaginable crisis. A sudden WC-135 Constant Phoenix deployment toward Europe would also draw attention. The WC-135 collects atmospheric samples to identify radioactive material associated with nuclear events. The Air Force Technical Application Center exists specifically to detect and report technical evidence from foreign nuclear explosions. Those systems would be important after a detonation. Some could also move beforehand if American intelligence believed the risk had risen sharply. Public flight trackers have limits. One E-4B training flight doesn't mean Armageddon is scheduled for Thursday. Military aircraft train constantly, and the most sensitive operational movements may not appear on civilian tracking services at all. Ballistic missile submarines are even worse indicators. Their entire career field revolves around avoiding strangers with maps. The pattern matters more than the individual aircraft, so watch for command aircraft activity, intelligence flights, senior officials canceling appearances, emergency NATO meetings, public warnings from Washington, and unusual Russian force movements occurring together. The U.S. would also likely begin exposing intelligence publicly, as it did before Russia's full-scale invasion in February of 2022. Washington might name the Russian unit, describe the weapon movement, warn Russian commanders personally, and tell the world that Moscow was preparing nuclear use before the Kremlin could manufacture a story about British laboratories or genetically modified combat badgers. That public intelligence campaign would serve two purposes. It would deny Putin surprise. It would also tell the officers handling the weapon that the West knows who they are. So, the absence of these signs is reassuring. Bloomberg sources said there are currently no indications whatsoever that Russia is preparing to deploy tactical nuclear weapons. Their assessment is that Moscow is using fear to pressure the US and Europe into reducing support for Ukraine. The weird thing is, that hasn't happened yet. Why would Moscow bluff now and think that it's going to work all of a sudden? Those officials consider additional mobilization or more aggressive hybrid operations against NATO members more plausible escalation options. That's probably my assessment too, but I don't want to discredit the nuke possibility. Still, Putin currently gets more value from threatening nuclear use than he would get from an actual detonation. A tactical nuke would not repair Russia's economy, reduce its casualties, hold a trench, or rebuild the Black Sea Fleet, or stop Ukrainian drones from finding another oil refinery. Ukraine's forces are dispersed across a wide battlefield. There may be a few military targets concentrated enough to justify the enormous political cost of nuclear use. Russia could destroy one position and create a worldwide crisis without solving the operational problem that drove Putin to consider the weapon in the first place. There is no radioactive cure for Kremlin incompetence. I think the greatest danger here comes if Putin concludes that nuke use could force a ceasefire on favorable terms. If Russia detonates a weapon and receives territory, sanctions relief, or negotiations that freeze its gains, well, nuclear coercion succeeds. Every nuclear-armed government would then study that result. Every non-nuclear government living beside a stronger neighbor would study it too. The response from NATO, from Europe, from China, and the wider international community must make nuclear use a strategic failure. That does not require an American nuclear strike against Russia. Nuclear retaliation would risk an uncontrolled exchange and destroy the contrast between Moscow's action and the coalition responding to it. A massive conventional response would remain more likely. That could include destroying the Russian unit responsible, removing remaining restrictions on Ukrainian strikes, accelerating advanced weapons transfers, expanding NATO air defense coverage, maybe even a full NATO no-fly zone over Ukraine, and threatening individual Russian commanders with personal responsibility for further nuclear orders. You fire this nuke, the NATO coalition will target you personally. Really, the precise response would depend on the target, the yield, the fallout, the casualties, the attribution, and whether NATO territory was affected. It would also depend on the decision made inside the current White House, where predictability has never exactly been sold by the pound. China's warning helps deterrence because it removes one assumption Putin might carry into that decision. He can't count on Beijing to provide political cover after nuclear use. Russia might survive Western isolation because China keeps trade moving, but it can't easily survive Western isolation and Chinese abandonment simultaneously. That may be the only warning Putin respects, more than a NATO communique containing the words grave concern 14 times. So, should we worry? Yes, although we should worry intelligently. China's reported message is significant, the growing nuclear discussion inside Russia is significant, the subject reaching leader-level conversations at NATO is significant. The current absence of military preparation is equally significant. This is a warning light, not an explosion. In 2023, I wrote that a Chinese warning would tell us concern had moved beyond Western governments and reached the one country with enough leverage to restrain Putin. Well, that moment appears to have arrived. The most reassuring interpretation is that Beijing is reinforcing a boundary it has maintained throughout the war. The more troubling interpretation is that China heard enough from Russia, Ukraine, or Western governments to believe the boundary needed reinforcement now. We can't yet know which explanation carries more weight. For the moment, watch the hardware, watch the storage sites, watch the delivery units, watch the command aircraft, watch whether China confirms the message publicly or applies visible pressure through trade and diplomacy. Don't confuse Kremlin theater with preparation. Don't dismiss the theater simply because Putin has performed it before. Nuclear deterrence survives through credibility and communication and the shared understanding that crossing the line leaves the aggressor worse off than before. Putin has spent 4 years telling the world that Russia has no limits. China just reminded him that one of his few remaining partners does. That may be enough. It had better be. That's it for today, my friends. If this kind of analysis is useful to you, 3 quick things. Channel memberships are about $3 a month, and they directly support this work without requiring me to pretend that a VPN company has personally changed my life through a sponsored segment. I hate ads as much as you do. Hit subscribe so YouTube stops treating you like an unidentified aircraft approaching restricted airspace, and the QR code on the screen takes you to my Substack at wesodonnell.com, where the full nuclear scenario and deeper analysis are available. And as always, glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. Crimea is Ukraine.